Hi there, Biney here. So before we move on to how we can make inputs or interact with the various UI elements so that we perform some action here and there is something very important that I would like for us to discuss, and that is understanding the UI elements and the selection processes that goes on in the background for the automation tool to be able to target exactly the UI element that you intend to have the automation to interact with, without which I'm pretty sure you're going to encounter some errors here and there when you are trying to interact with the element during your automation flow, and we wouldn't want that. All right, so in our case, we can see that we have on our web page, we can talk of an element like this card here. This is actually an element we can grab as a whole. We can talk of the form text that we have here that can also be interacted with. Pretty much anything you are seeing on the screen within the web application window and even the browser window itself can be interacted with. In our case, our main focus is going to be on the text field here, how we are going to get information in there, how we are going to manipulate these radio buttons so that we can select the one that we desire at any point in time, how we can work with the drop down so that we choose the exact option that we want, how we can toggle this checkbox on and off, then using of the file picker, how we are going to target it to click on it so that we get these and then we choose the one that we want, and then essentially how we are going to click on the button down here. So these are the things that we are going to have to look at, the selection code that is behind it so that we can tweak it to our advantage. Alright, so I'm going to start that with the text field over here, and so we'll go to our UI elements area by clicking the UI elements button here at the right, and then we look for the UI element that we captured, and in this case we named it txt name. Now you have these three buttons here you can click on. You get these options: edit, rename, find usages, delete. You can actually double click on it to get to the selector UI window, but then I'm going to do the edit one. So we get this UI dialog window open for us that we can interact with. Now, at first glance, you are met with this, and let's just move down here where we see preview selector. At the point where we see preview selector, one thing that we would notice is that it says input. It has the ID equal to, so this is actually the selector that makes it possible to target this particular field, text field here. If we are to test it to see how it works, let me first select the exact browser tab we are working with. Now we can test it. Now anytime you test a selector and then you get this green check by the selector, that means that the selector was successful in targeting the exact element on the page. Okay, let me do this. We have nothing selected, so if we test, you see we get an error. So if you have an issue with your selector, you get this telling you that the test result has failed. Okay, but if you don't have any issue with it and then you test, you are going to get a green check mark. When you click on it, it tells you that it was successful. Okay, and we always want to be successful with the selector. So with our UI selector edit window open, we see that within the window we have the ability to create a new selector. We can also use an image as a fallback. By using an image as a fallback, for instance, I could capture this field, an image of this field, so that the automation tool will use that image when my default selector does not work properly, in order to identify that UI element and then interact with it. If it has an issue to it that needs to be repaired, you can use the repair button here. Then this is the test button that allows us to test the selector that we've created to verify whether it is able to really target the UI element that we want or not. We can actually test all as well, and then we have the ability to create a copy to rename the selector that we've created and all that. Alright, so let's test out this particular selector here and see. So we click on that, we click on test, and it's going to ask you for the tab, the specific tab within the browser window that you want to interact with. In our case, it's going to be this one, but that's the only one we have open. But if you have several tabs open, they will all show up there. We click on OK. Now you realize you get this red around it, and you get this green text over here within the window. Now this indicates that your selector was successful in targeting that particular UI element, which is a good sign. Let me take this off, and now let's try to test it and see what will happen. So if you get this red icon, exclamation, that means that your selector was not successful in identifying the UI element, and so it failed. Okay, so you might want to check and then tweak it to correct that. Alright, so let's toggle that back on. I would like us to try to understand how this works, okay? So that if you happen to find yourself in that situation where the selector is throwing an error, you'll be able to correct that. There is one more thing that I want us to take a look at before we even go to tweaking it. Let me uncheck this student name ID here, ID field here. Now essentially what we are saying is that we are targeting a selector that is an input tag, okay, that has an input tag. So let's test it. Now you realize we have not a green, not a red, but a yellow, and when we click on it, it tells us that we have multiple UI controls. So yes, it found some UI elements, but then instead of targeting a specific UI element, it has found more than one. So the question is, which one should it work with? And that also creates a problem. Usually when that happens, you're going to try to pick the first one within that multiple selections, okay? So but you would want to be specific. That is the safest, okay? So that it doesn't pick the one that you were not intending to target, and that is the reason why these are here. So for instance, we are targeting an input element with an ID of student name. We can also target with an ID with checked false. Now when we do this, guess which one that is going to select? When you look on the page, there are some elements that have this property, the check or not checked property, okay? So we can target the various elements on the page by referencing the various attributes that the element may have. And this is where I will advise, it is advised, not mandatory anyway, but then if you know it, it helps in understanding this. And the things that you would have to, I'm advising you would have to get yourself acquainted with very well is knowledge on HTML and CSS, specifically CSS selectors, and if possible some JavaScript or jQuery here and there. And these really help with manipulating the elements on the web page. Okay, so in this case, for instance, we are targeting an element with an input tag. So anybody who understands these things that I have mentioned will clearly see that is what is being manipulated here. And when you talk of the attributes, of an element, some of these these are the attributes that usually an element may have. May not necessarily have all of these, and even this list here is non-exhaustive. Okay, if you would like to know how these attributes you can determine them, you can just right click anywhere on the web page, go to inspect. You can also do Ctrl+Shift+I for most web browsers and it will appear. Then you get the HTML that is rendered for you to get the web page you will be looking at. And so you do realize that if I point to a particular HTML, it shows me where it is. Okay, you can also use this element selector up here and then click on a particular element on the page, and that should open. In our case, we are interested in the text field here, so you can just pick the element selector and then click on it, and then it tells you that it's an input. You see, it has an input tag, and these are the attributes. The one that has some text, an equal sign, and then something in between, some code. Okay, so we have, for instance, type equal text. So that means that we can even use that to target it. So for you to freely manipulate this, though you can set the attributes here, you can come to the text editor, toggle that on, and here's how you're going to do it. You bring the two square brackets, and then in there, so for instance, I can type, okay, because that's the attribute that we had there. Then we said the type is what? Text. So essentially, an element with an input tag that has an attribute of type with its value equal to text. That is how you can interpret it to be. So let's test this and see. See, it found it. So essentially, I could actually target any other, it doesn't matter the UI element that I selected to edit. If I change the selector code behind it, it will pinpoint to the particular element that I am pointing to. So for instance, if I do class equal to radio button, okay, and for instance the class equal to radio button, note that it doesn't have an input tag, rather it has a label. So if I change this to label and I make this class equals radio dash option, so I think that's what we have there. And then we test it out. Let's see what happens. Yeah, so it found it. Okay, and essentially you would realize that it found multiple results. That's because we have this for male, this for female. So how do you target the exact one that you want? And that is where you can use this EQ 0, and that should also essentially what we are saying is it should get us the first item, okay, the first item. So yeah, so if we want the second one, which happens to be a female, we can do 1, so 0 1. So we start the counting from 0, then we do upwards, okay. So when we test it now, I'm expecting to get female, and that is what is selected, okay. So essentially, if you get to understand it, you are able to manipulate the element in that form. Another way this same expression can be written is, let me put it down here and then change this. Now with class, we show class by using a dot, okay, and then you can get rid of this and that. Let me get rid of this and let's see if it works. See, it works. So this is another way you can write the same expression as this, okay. So instead of saying label square brackets and indicating class equals this and that, you can actually do label dot radio. The dot there signifies it's a class that you are referencing. In the case where it is an ID that you intend to reference, let me see. All right, so this input ID student name, what you can do is in the same format, you do input. With ID we use the hash sign. So ID is what? Student name. So this is how the ID is. So let's test that out and see if we are able to find it. Good. So an input with an ID of student name. So that also works perfectly. So these are the ways we can actually target the various elements on the page. One other thing that you'd have to take note of is that there are several ways you can write this selector expression, okay. Several ways. We have so many options. The more the reason why I'm saying that we have to get ourselves well acquainted with the CSS selectors, and that will really help us to understand and target the various elements on the page so easily if you actually understand them. So for instance, let's see if we can do a different one. We have this div here, okay, and then let's see. So this label item here, try to put them on the same line. This label item here and then this input item here. If we look at the structure, you realize that this div here is a parent to this label and this input, and so we say that this label and then this input, they are siblings, but then each of them is a child to this div. And so when writing, we can also do input and then bring this greater than symbol, indicating that under the input it has a direct child. So we are targeting the label item, a label, okay. Forgive me, I think we have a div here, and then yeah, the div which is a label. So we test it out like this, yeah, and that is found. But then of course there are multiple div with labels, okay. That's not the only one, and that's why we are getting the yellow one. And so if we want to target a different one or a specific one, we can actually start the numbering thingy, and then it targets a specific one. So as we increase the number, it moves down the structure. Yeah. Another thing that you can take note of is you can tell it that we use this dwindle sign and say input. All that we are saying is that there is a div that has a child of label, and that label child item has a sibling of input. Okay, and that one too gets us that. So this is the only place we have that. So a div with a label of input as a sibling. Then we can also do div and say int child, and then also use this. But take note of the fact that when you are using this int child, we have so many of them actually. We could make mention of first child, last child, end child, and use the numbering system to iterate or select a specific end item. I could also do, and please note that if you are using the end child kind of stuff, you don't start with a 0. It doesn't work that way. That one starts with 1. Okay, but if you are using the EQ, the first item is a 0. But if you are using the end child, the first item is 1. Okay, so we can also do end of type, and then we test that out. That also picks something. Let me just do a 2. We can also do last of type, where we remove this. There will be no numbering for that. Let me just do input here. Now when we space it out, what it means is that we don't want to have a direct child, but we are saying somewhere down the tree we have an input item. Okay, and I want to get the last of that type, and so there it is. Okay, div input last of type, and then we grab that. We can also do last child. That should be more specific. Okay, we can also do end of type. For instance, if we want to target all of them, end of type, and then you open that, you put in the n, essentially getting me all the inputs. Okay, so you see that you get multiple selections, where maybe with that you might want to still come in here and then do this and get that. Okay, so we have so many ways that you can actually target the element within the browser window. So many ways that we can target that. In our case, we said we had an input element that has an ID equal to student name. Note that you may choose to put this within double quote, single quote, or even, sorry, or even leave it if it doesn't have any space in there. When I say space, for instance, if it has space, then the double quote or single quote is mandatory, but if it doesn't have, you can leave it like that and it will still work. So let me just demonstrate that. Good. Another thing that you need to take note of is the fact that you can do partial matches, look at the end, so for instance, if I say equal to, it means it is exactly equal to student name, but I can also say it starts with, so you are looking at something that starts with the word student, then you put this here. So input with an ID, this simple symbol allows us to say starts with. So when we test it, let's see if we will be able to target it. Good, it targets it. We can also say ends with by using the dollar sign, and this time I know the word name, and it's case sensitive, so you might want to look out for that. So ends with name, that one too. We can also say let's target somewhere in the middle. Contains, you know, the whole thing is student name, so I may choose to get rid of this. Let me just do this. So we are saying we want to target something that contains, we use the asterisk, that contains, so we are saying somewhere in there contains these characters. That one too essentially works. If you want to use actually a regex in itself, you put the @ sign just before the equal to, so regex, and then maybe an input, let's say. Of course, we can also say student and then do asterisk. Let me good. So again, regex can also be used this way. So all we are saying is student and ID. Using this regex, we are saying it starts with student and then some characters follow. Okay. So the dot here, any results to any characters. We can actually put a plus sign to here. So also knowledge of regex also helps here. If you understand how regex works, that one too will help you target the items on the page. Alright, so let's default back to what was in there, which was what? Student name, and take this off. Test it, and it works. And so that is how your UI element can be targeted. If you're having any problem, just inspect and then you use that to target it.